Hello everyone. This week I wanted to talk a little bit more about my interest in guerrilla warfare during the American Civil War. I talked a little bit about this last week in my video I posted last week, but I wanted to focus a little bit more on this study, particularly for the Confederacy and their dealing with this issue during the American Civil War. It gets a lot less attention than the Union government, who dealt with it considerably in Missouri and Virginia. And so I wanted to focus more on particularly the source of some of the guerrillas that the Confederacy deals with. Primarily the issue of desertion. That will be the source of some of their deserters. And I focused this study particularly on South Carolina and North Carolina. These are pretty unique areas, especially South Carolina. And I picked 3 articles off of JSTOR, all of them dealing with the issue of desertion for the Confederacy on different levels. The first one is James Ottens' 1974 article, Disloyalty in the Upper Districts of South Carolina during the American Civil War. Patrick Doyle's 2013 article, Understanding the Desertion of South Carolinian Soldiers During the Final Years of the Confederacy. And the final one is Judkin Browning's 2000 article titled Souled Mercenaries, the Buffaloes of Eastern North Carolina During the Civil War. All 3 of these articles touch on the issue of desertion somehow, particularly for the Confederacy. Otten's 1974 article is particularly valuable because it's foundational for the study of Unionism here in South Carolina, where I live. Otten argues, quote, that in the upper districts of South Carolina, the factor which contributed most to disloyalty was the prevalence of Unionism. To support this argument, Otten leaned heavily into newspaper articles, government correspondence with locals in the area, as well as the observations of locals who complained about the issues of desertion as well as disloyalty in the district. He also will draw on sources from Union prisoners of war who interact with the locals up in the upper counties of Greenville, Pickens, and Anderson, who will describe this being a particular issue for the Confederacy in this area. And he will trace his article largely chronologically through the issue as it goes on during the war. So to start before the war, talk about Unionism in these areas before the war and how it contributed later during the war to desertion and guerrilla conflict up in the mountains of South Carolina, as those deserters helped Union's prisoners of war escape and resist the Confederate government's efforts to bring them back into military service. Doyle's 2013 article is really an expansion on Otten's 1974 work, where he will argue that, quote, ultimately for certain groups of South Carolinian deserters, particularly those from specific regions or of certain ethnicities that may have imbued them with an ambivalence toward the top conflict, ideology, or unionism, was a motivator for them to leave the army, often operating in tandem with concerns about family and worsening poverty at home. Doyle focuses his study on South Carolinians who deserted and then took a loyalty oath to the Union government once they got home, because he believed that had an explicit ideological emphasis behind it, although he will also understand and acknowledge the fact that that isn't a guarantee. He also will draw on sources from local officials and locals. He'll approach it from bottom up and top down when it comes to primary sources, and he'll incorporate census records for deserters that he can identify, and especially if they popped up in the 1860 census, particularly to examine their socioeconomic background. He'll focus a little bit on the argument that these men are largely non-slave holding whites who come from an area of South Carolina where there wasn't a heavy emphasis on slave ownership, and as a result made them little identified with the Confederate cause, which then contributed to their unionism and decision to go home, especially as economics got worse for those at home due to Confederate policies. The final article, Judkin Browning's 2000 article, Souled Mercenaries, the Buffaloes of Eastern North Carolina during the Civil War, is also focused on the issue of desertion as well. I found it particularly interesting because in previous research of mine indicated that some South Carolinians from those upper districts that Otten talked about potentially enlisted in North Carolina Unionist regiments, which is what Browning focuses his study on, which is the 1st and 2nd North Carolina Union Infantry. Judkin will argue that The North Carolina natives who fought for the Union in the 1st and 2nd North Carolina Union regiments generally were poor folk who did not feel compelled to fight for the slave institution in which they had no vested interest, and therefore bridled at the stringent efforts of Confederate conscription officers. The majority of them joined the Union Army near their homes and families. Like Doyle, Browning incorporates a lot of top-down sources and bottom-up type sources in his examination, sources from government officials and things like that, and the men themselves whenever possible, as well as enlistment records and census records to get an idea on these men's socioeconomic backgrounds. And as indicated in his argument, comes to very similar conclusions about deserters as Doyle did in South Carolina. All three of these articles really focus on socioeconomic concerns as being the primary cause to cause men to desert from Confederate service or even decide to go home and resist the Confederate government. Not because they had anti-slavery feelings or abolitionist feelings, but that they didn't feel identified with the Confederate cause. Certainly that doesn't apply to all non-slaveholding whites. Certainly some enlisted and remained loyal and fought in the Confederate Army during the war, but all three of these really highlight the importance of socioeconomic concerns for the Confederacy, particularly with desertion, and in a way, the backlash that could have. I really appreciate you for taking the time to listen to this, and I appreciate any feedback I can get on improving these videos or the content within them. Until next time, I'll see you next week.